Bonjour, bonjour, and welcome to another episode of Paris in Bleu, Blanc, Rouge with me, Claudine Hemingway. And I am giving you an episode today that I've been trying to do for 3 years. And every August, I would try to do this, but our recording times would never sync up the podcast I used to do. And so it would always have to be done in like September and October. And I didn't really want to talk about the liberation of Paris. So now I could bring it to you, and I bring it to you on the actual day that they celebrate the liberation of Paris, August 25th, 1944. So this is a pretty amazing time. And what's interesting is that, they always are, marking the big things. But as I'm going to tell you, I think there's sometimes we should remember about every single year for some of these things. I mean, we don't just celebrate our birthdays every 5s or 10s, right? So we're going to jump right into it. It is dark. It is very early in the morning. There is rain outside, which, we've had a little rain lately, but not a lot. And it's been great. It's actually been kind of cold in the morning. So after all of our heat waves, but there's also been some thunder and lightning. So I had the window open a little bit, but then it just was getting too loud. So I'm hoping it's going to be gone so I could actually head up to the Liberation Museum this morning. And just the rain's okay, but I don't really want to walk outside with an umbrella in the lightning. So let's get into this amazing story. So there's many events that truly altered and changed the entire trajectory of hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And every 5 years, we mark the rounded anniversaries of the Armistice, the VE Day, D-Day, and the liberation of Paris. While the clean numbers are 5s and 10s are nice, we should remind it of many things every single year. At the end of August 1944, the Parisians had had enough, and after 4 years of occupation, they were going to take matters into their own hands. It all began in the most French way possible: strikes. On August 10th, 1944, the SNCF metro and train workers went on strike. The trains had been an integral part of the Nazi looting of art, furniture, and the deportation of French citizens. The resistance frequently blew up train tracks and disrupted the lines as often as possible over the 4 years of the occupation. After the SNCF began to strike, the Parisian police and the National Gendarmes followed on August 15th. The next day, La Poste and the Telegraph followed. Paris came to a grinding halt. Since June 6th and Operation Overload on the beaches of Normandy, there was a quiet rumble of hope that the end of the war was coming. On July 14th, 1944, more than 100,000 people marched through Paris and the surrounding areas. For the first time in 4 years, the people marked the Fête Nationale together and in the public singing La Marseillaise. The Germans were not giving up their hold and control. On August 16th, after leading resistance fighters into a false meetup in the Bois de Boulogne, they executed all 35 members, sending a message. Although the writing was on the wall, they still managed to get the last train of deportees out of Drancy, included over 2,000 people. Everything changed on August 18th. Colonel Henri Rouleau-Tanguy headed the French Forces of the Interior, known as the FFI. With the backing of General Leclerc and General de Gaulle, Rouleau-Tanguy released a plea to the French people of mobilize and revolt. In the dark of night, posters were hung on walls and published in newspapers, although the collaborationist papers declined to print them. The order called for all able-bodied men aged 18 to 50 to arm themselves by all means, in particular by recovering equipment from enemy soldiers, to attack the enemy wherever they are, in the streets or in the premises, their vehicles and fuel depots. They also needed to protect all public services from attacks such as water, gas, and electricity. The lack of artillery was a major concern within Paris. Rouleau-Tanguy counted around 600 rifles up against more than 20,000 armed Germans. This wasn't going to stop the people. Barricades were built using anything they could find: cobblestones, the heavy iron tree grates, furniture, and even cars. On August 19th, at the Paris prefecture, in the shadows of Notre-Dame de Paris, 3,000 of the striking police, dressed in plain clothes, stormed the prefecture and lost the battle to liberate the capital. The FFI encircled the prefecture with barricades built on the left and right bank, from the Square Viviani to the Fontaine Saint-Michel on the left bank and the Hôtel de Ville and the Place de Châtelet on the right. That same day, Swedish Consul General Roel Nordling paid a visit to General Dietrich von Colchitz at the Hotel Maurice on the Rue de Rivoli. Colchitz had been appointed to the General of Paris by Hitler on August 7, 1944. Nordling was born in Paris in 1882 to a Swedish father and French mother. In 1905, he was named the Vice Consul of Sweden and later the Consul General in 1926. With a gift of diplomacy, he spoke for Sweden with the French. In the later years of World War II, Nordling was a trusted spokesperson, mediating between French and German, trying to urge Göring and Vichy leaders Marshal Pétain to convince Hitler to retreat after D-Day, and wasn't getting anywhere. On August 17th, the two would meet for the first time. Nordling was able to negotiate on behalf of the French Red Cross with Colchitz for the release of all the prisoners in the surrounding prison. Just 10 days after his arrival, he knew the German position was losing ground quickly. Colchitz wanted to know what he would get in return. Nordling promised they would release all German prisoners, although Colchitz had no idea it was just a handful of people. Nordling sent trusted aides to the prisons of Drancy, Compiègne, and Romainville to order the release. He was too late at Compiègne. The train had already left but would be intercepted in a few days. Nordling's effort gave 4,231 people their freedom from the Germans. On August 19th, in the hours after the FFI took control of the prefecture, the inevitable couldn't be avoided much longer. Georges Bidault and Alexandre Parodi, leaders of the National Council of the Resistance, wanted to negotiate a ceasefire with Colchitz. The FFI were unwilling to deal and wanted to keep the fighting going. They had brought the Germans to their knees on their own before either army arrived. Nordling, within a few short days, had proven to be the Colchitz whisperer and asked again to pull off the ultimate win. Representatives from all sides gathered at the Hôtel de Ville in central Paris, recently restored to the French. Nordling negotiated between all the parties and by noon had an agreement. The ceasefire was to start on August 20th at 3:30 p.m. and was announced over the loudspeakers across Paris, although many on both sides chose to ignore it and kept fighting. Roel Tanguy, leader of the FFI, said, "As long as the Germans are in Paris, we will keep on fighting." As the uprising poured into the streets, German soldiers with white flags on their cars drove up to the barricades on the corner of Rue Viviani opposite Notre Dame and began to shoot and kill anyone they came across. With the reports of arrests of Nazi soldiers on the horizon, they weren't going down without a fight. At the same time, German soldiers had been spending the last few weeks attaching explosives to the many monuments and all the bridges in central Paris. 3 tons of explosives were brought to Notre Dame, 2 tons to Les Invalides, and another 2 at the Arc de Triomphe, all from the direct order of Hitler. Hitler gave the order to destroy Paris. Quote, "Paris must not pass into the Allies' hands except as a field of ruins." General Charles de Gaulle returned to France on August 20th, landing in Cherbourg at 8 a.m. and heading straight to meet General Eisenhower. Ike wanted to avoid Paris as he didn't see it as a priority, and taking the Germans in the city would be a logistical nightmare. At Ike's headquarters in Tonnerre, just outside of Bayeux, de Gaulle met with Ike to try to convince him. General Leclerc arrived earlier and started the ball rolling, and Ike would not budge. On August 21st, de Gaulle wrote up another plan and sent in an admired general to hand-deliver the proposal. General Koenig successfully led the campaign in Ber Hakeim and was admired by Eisenhower. Over the next 24 hours, the news from Paris and the FFI captured and controlled many of the streets and former Nazi strongholds, as well as the likely surrender of Colchitz convinced Ike they just might head to Paris after all. On August 22nd at 2 p.m., it was agreed between Ike and de Gaulle that General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division of the French Army, along with the American 4th Infantry, would make their way to Paris. Just after 6 a.m., before the sun rose on August 23rd, the 2nd Armored Division, which included more than 16,000 soldiers, set off from Rambouillet, 48 kilometers southwest of Paris. With 200 tanks and 370 cannons towed to Paris, the drive took nearly a full day. The American forces of 14,000 soldiers, including 30 tanks and 350 cannons, and 1 American rider. More on that in a minute. On August 24th at 8 p.m., before the French and Americans arrived at the capital, a group of Spanish fighters known as La Nueve reached the cobblestones first. A part of Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division made up of 208 Spanish Republicans and French soldiers. By 9:22 p.m., the group arrived at the Hôtel de Ville to great applause, led by Lieutenant Armando Granel, who would also be a part of the downfall of Colchitz the next day. It was on the 24th that for the first time since the war and occupation, the bells of the churches of Paris began to ring. At 10:10 p.m., Emmanuel, the largest and oldest bell of Notre Dame, rang out for the first time, followed by the bells of Saint-Sulpice, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and on and on and on. People in the streets sang La Marseillaise and screamed Vive la France, although the Germans and armed militia still stood their ground in Paris. Here's a little fun fact. The clocks that were on the outside of Notre Dame, until recently, now that they're working, they were set at 10:10 p.m. until they were fixed. So for the last few years. As the French and American soldiers traveled to Paris, every town and road they passed through was lined with thousands of thankful French citizens. Open jeeps are filled with bottles of wine, champagne, and beer, so much so that once they entered Paris, they were handing it out to anyone who approached. At 7:45 on the morning of August 25th in southern Paris, the 2nd Armored Division arrived, coming through the Porte d'Orléans and the Porte de Gentilly. In Paris, the FFI now numbered 20,000, as did the police and security forces. Later that evening, the British Army and the American 4th Infantry arrived. The 17,000 German soldiers that remained were highly outnumbered. By August 25th, the tide had turned. The arrival of the French, British, and American armies were more of a parade than a way to bring the Germans to their knees. The FFI had already done that. At 1 p.m., FFI soldiers and Henri Carcher of de Gaulle's army entered the Maurice on the Rue de Rivoli and demanded to see Choltitz. Threatened that he would be tried as a war criminal, he was taken into custody. As a prefecture on the Ile de la Cité, where the FFI rose up just 6 days before, Choltitz signed his surrender at 2:45 p.m. At 5 p.m. at the Gare Montparnasse, with General Leclerc and General de Gaulle, Choltitz ended the occupation by surrendering the German army. Choltitz would be sent to London with other high-ranking German officers, while many others were rounded up, arrested, and held outside in the Salon Carré of the Louvre. At 7:30 p.m. in front of the Hôtel de Ville, Charles de Gaulle would make a speech that would follow him the rest of his life and be immortalized in stone and bronze. Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. That night, Paris was filled with the energy few had felt in over 4 years, but the war wasn't over, and there were still the last German holdouts and the militia that was growing. During the war, the militia, known as the Milice, was created in 1943 and was made up of soldiers and devotees of the fascist Vichy regime. Given carte blanche to detain and deport Jews and others they felt were unworthy of remaining in France with the Nazi ideals, they were given incentives to join and appeal to angry men who also needed money. Led by the former French World War I war hero Joseph Dornon, who became an SS officer and pledged his allegiance to Hitler, he was told to, quote, create special court-martials to try on the spot. Persons caught in violent acts against the state, the law was without precedent in modern French legal history. By the end of the war, others joined in the militia, including Japanese, Americans, Germans, and many other angry young men and women who hid behind masks. Dornon was arrested in Italy by the British in July 1945 and later tried and executed for his collaboration. History. You just can't make this up. In the final days of the liberation, the militia joined the remaining Germans to a fight to the death. There was one man who took on the militia in Paris. Ernest Hemingway was staying in the city of Rambouillet with his makeshift troop of men composed of American and FFI soldiers. As the days till the liberation of Paris got closer, he wanted to head back to the center of the action and celebration. A convoy of soldiers, including him, headed towards the City of Light. Just after noon, Hemingway and his band of men crossed into Paris over the Seine on the Pont de Sèvres. It was August 25, 1944, and the drive to the city was filled with people standing along the road, cheering the soldiers as they passed, and his first stop was to see his dear friend Sylvia Beach. Living at 18 Rue de l'Odéon, Hemingway came barreling down the street, yelling out her name. Sylvia ran down the street, brought her dear friend upstairs at the 4th floor, and wondered what he could do for her. Sylvia and Adrien Monnier asked if he could remove the Germans and the militia still firing from the roofs of Odéon. Hemingway returned to his liberated Mercedes, grabbed some men and guns, and returned to the roof of her building. Gunfire was heard for a few minutes, then total silence. Odéon was liberated, and the nightmare was over. The story of where he went next is a story many think they know. As the story goes, Hemingway wanted to be the first American to liberate the Ritz. He pushed his way to get an audience with General Leclerc to ask for men and weapons. Leclerc told him to buzz off, but he wasn't to be deterred. With his driver, Sergeant Red Pelkey, and a handful of soldiers and journalists, they swung into the door of the Ritz. With machine guns in hands, he saw the manager, Claude Oziel, and asked him where the Germans were. Monsieur, they left long ago. He invited them in, but they had to leave the machine guns in the Mercedes. Him and his men marched into the Ritz bar and instructed the barman to make them Montgomery martinis, which is 17 parts gin to 1 part vermouth, which is how the British Marshal Montgomery liked to face his Germans, 17 men to 1 German. Everyone, including the Ritz, say that Hemingway drank 51 of these alone. In fact, his entire party drank them together. The bar Hemingway was named in 1994 in the former ladies' bar space. The bar where he drank these martinis is now the Ritz Patisserie. When I give my Hemingway tours in Paris, it's the one fact that a lot of people bring up is the 51 martinis. And if just think about it, you literally would die, especially if it was 17 parts to 1 and you drank 51 of those. You would die. But even the Ritz website has it that he alone drank those. So can't always believe everything. A few years ago, I found a website dedicated to capturing the stories of those who lived through the World War II occupation in Paris and the small towns of France. As the greatest generation disappears, it's more important to inscribe these recollections before they are lost forever. One I uncovered I had never forgotten. André Auvenet was a 56-year-old lawyer for the SNCF and lived at 3 Rue Palatine, across the street from the south side of the Église Saint-Sulpice. Auvenet kept a detailed account noting the days leading up to August 26, especially in his Saint-Germain-des-Prés neighborhood. Each morning he walked with his colleague Tricot down the Rue de Seine to the Pont des Arts. On August 19th, he noted that the air in Paris had changed. What had once been calm and quiet with people hiding in their homes now carried a bit of agitation. A young girl they passed in the street told him she just saw German soldiers machine gun down a crowd of people at the Rue de Bac. On August 20th, Auvenet saw posters calling for the French aged 18 to 50 to grab arms and join the fight to take back Paris. At the same time, another mass shooting occurred on the corner of Rue Vaugirard with the Germans on the roof of the Senate. The truce was in place, but they didn't care. The shots continued from the Église Saint-Germain-des-Prés up Rue Bonaparte to the Place Saint-Sulpice. On August 21st, the FFI began to outnumber the Germans, but the gunfire increased. People sheltered in the dark corners of their homes as the Germans and militia could be seen on the roofs running from building to building. On August 22nd, French tanks increased their presence on the Boulevard Saint-Germain and Boulevard Saint-Michel where the barricades were built. On August 20th, Auvenet noted roof shooters out our window for the 4th night. They were Germans dressed in civilian clothes with women and Asians of the Daran militia. The French papers began to publish again on this day, adding a return to normalcy. August 24th, Auvenet and his wife have dinner. They begin to hear cries and screaming in the street. This time it wasn't out of fear, a sound they hadn't heard in a very long time. People in droves were heading to the Hôtel de Ville to see General Leclerc. At 10:10 p.m., they heard the bells of Notre Dame, followed by the bells of Saint-Sulpice just out their window. August 25th, the tanks of Leclerc rolled through the Rue de Fort and Rue de Bussy. A walk through the neighborhood that evening, André found the markings of the gunfire along the buildings on Rue Bonaparte, Rue de Flore, and one of the worst on the Rue Auguste Comte, along the walls of the Lycée Montaigne. These remains all are there to this day in Paris, but especially in the 5th, 6th, and on the Ile de la Cité. On the very morning of August 26, André and his family left at 3 a.m. to walk to the Avenue des Champs-Élysées to join in the parade led by Charles de Gaulle. There isn't a day I walk through these streets, Auvenet mentioned, and I don't think about his words. On August 26, Paris celebrated the final defeat of the Germans and the end of the occupation of their city. The end of World War II in Europe would eventually come on May 8, 1945, but on this August day, 86 years ago, they celebrated. At 3 p.m., de Gaulle arrived at the top of the Champs-Élysées. Laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, he took a brief moment. Shortly after, alongside General Leclerc and the other members of the Free French and Resistance, he took his tall 6'5" stature and strolled down the Champs-Élysées towards Notre Dame. Over 2 million people lined the avenue of the Place de la Concorde. This city may have been liberated, but the German snipers still fired down into the crowd, killing 582 people in the days of the liberation. Arriving in Notre Dame, de Gaulle carried on unfazed by the German gunfire. Inside the cathedral, the crowd sang Te Deum, and as they hid under the hymnals as Germans shot at them inside the church. Today, at the edge of the Champs-Élysées, a tall statue of de Gaulle is a perfect depiction of his wide gate looks ahead. Created by Jacques Cardot, it was inaugurated on November 9, 2000, the 30th anniversary of his death. Before his death, he expressed his wish that no monuments be dedicated to him. His son later agreed that they should have at least one marking the great man at a very heroic and monumental moment. On the side, emblazoned in bronze, are his words of August 24th. Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris freed. Other just as important reminders are all over Paris. Over 2,000 plaques are scattered throughout Paris today, and everyone has a story. Below each plaque is a small ring on which the city places a bouquet each year on the anniversary of the liberation. Paris didn't waste any time installing these plaques, and they began to appear as soon as October 1944. They were placed on buildings and parks. Family members left flowers and inscribed the walls with memories of those they lost. They are one of my favorite things to come across, and I always stop, and I have hundreds of pictures of them on my phone. And just a few of them I wanted to share. There's one of Georges Bailly. He was a student at the age of 24. Michael Mouchet, a member of the Sapeurs-Pompiers. Jean-Charles Touchet, age 18. And Madeleine Brinet, a nurse. And so many all died for France on August 25th, 1944. When you come across these plaques, stop and take a minute and look at them. The pleasure of strolling the streets of Paris is partly due to their sacrifice. On the Rue de Seine, on the wall of the Institut de France, is a small niche with a plaque for Commander Louis Elie, killed on that spot on August 19th. The 55-year-old resistance fighter survived being captured by the Germans in World War I and fought against them. The niche also holds one of my favorite drawings of a guardian angel by Jean-Charles de Castelbajac. During World War II, many women stood up for the fight in France in any way they could, and for many years they were left off from the history pages. Marie-Madeleine Foucaud was born on November 8, 1909. She followed the path of most young girls. She attended the Couvent des Oiseaux, where all good girls went to become the perfect wife. At 18, she married Colonel Méric, and 5 children quickly followed. Being a wife and a mother was not all she had hoped and dreamed it would be, so she became a journalist. At first for the Vichy papers. When she realized what was truly behind the far-right movement, she moved into the resistance. In 1939, she met Georges Lousteau-Lassault, a high-ranking official and friend of Charles de Gaulle, and became his chief of staff of the Alliance Resistance. By 1940, they had to go underground. Marie would become the head of the alliance and recruited over 1,500 people to serve the network as pilots, couriers, and radio operators. She was known as Hedgehog. She was fearless and faced death every day. When the Germans figured out who she was and found her in a chateau and arrived to arrest her, she convinced them that she needed to take a bath first. When the officers went outside to smoke, she slipped out the door and made her way to Lyon. Arrested in November of 1942, she was able to escape on the way to the Castres prison thanks to a few compliant officers. With each attack on the Alliance, she would constantly rebuild the networks time after time. Highly decorated after the war, she would live a long life until 1989. Cécile Rowe-Tanguy was born on April 10, 1919, in Rouen to activist parents. At the start of World War II, she was the godmother of war, essentially a pen pal to a young soldier named Henri Tanguy. The two finally met face-to-face and were married on April 19, 1939. In 1940, they moved to Paris and began working underground for the resistance. She strolled through checkpoints with her baby stroller, which could be filled with guns, money, and grenades. After changing her name and paper, she stayed one step ahead of the Germans. When the war ended and de Gaulle arrived in Paris and marched down the Champs-Élysées, he held a reception in the Hôtel de Ville. Cécile was the only woman in attendance, and that was only because of her husband. After World War II, she became a friend of the fighting Spanish, and then François Hollande wanted to award her for her bravery. She initially declined, eventually decided she would accept it, but only on behalf of the women who had fought for the resistance. After the war, she and Henri continued their commitment to fighting fascism. With her daughter, she led Les Amis des Combattants de l'Espagne République and lived until the age of 101. Simone Seguin could be the most recognized of the ladies of the resistance. Her father worked in the resistance and in the local government. She was just 16 years old and dared to blow up bridges, lay traps, and damaged German-held villages. In Chartres, she stole the bicycle, repainted it, and spent a year riding all over the Loire delivering messages. On August 23, 1944, she took part on the liberation of Chartres, and 2 days later arrived in Paris for the big fight, the liberation of Paris. Her most famous image was shot on the streets of Paris, a young girl standing against a wall holding a German machine gun taken from a soldier. Photographer Jacques Boudin captured the moment on film, and it was featured in Life magazine, making it the most famous image of the resistance. After the war, she became a nurse, had 6 children, and never married. When she was offered the Legion of Honor Award, she initially refused, but accepted in 2021. Simone lived to be 97 years old and died on February 21st, 2023. There's so many of these stories that are just amazing, and I could go on and on and on and would make this episode 3 hours long. But they're just, I urge anybody when you come to Paris to just, when you're walking, stop and look at those signs. I had a tour client yesterday, and I was mentioning about this podcast that I was doing today, and she said she'd been to Paris a few times, but she was like, "Oh, I'm not sure I know what you mean about the plaques." And then she said, "Oh, are those the things on the wall? I was walking and there's all these plaques with names, and they had flowers in it right in the Place de la Concorde." And I said, "Yep, those are exactly them." So it is amazing. Maybe a lot of people don't know because they're also all written in French, but usually it's very specific what it has to say, their name, the date, and a little bit about them. So, if they were, gunned down by the Germans, or, they were in the resistance. So it's pretty amazing, but there's more and more of them, and they still add them throughout the city, even though we're 86 years past World War II. But there's a few other places in Paris that I urge you to visit if you're coming and you want to know more about this. They're not usually the things that people are doing on their first trip, unless you're really, kind of a history, nerd or military nerd. And I mean nerd in the most loving way possible, because I am probably the biggest one. But the Liberation Museum that's in the 15th, it's located there in the 15th, and the museum sits over the former headquarters of Rule Tanguy that he had set up there at the beginning of the liberation. And it's a free museum to go to, and it is amazing. It's all chronological. Just really brace yourself, because it is also very sad and difficult, but you get to the end of it, and there's recordings of the people on the Champs-Élysées and the parade, and it's very happy as you get to the end of it. Like I said, it's a free museum. They do special exhibits. Those usually have a price, and if you want to go down below to look at the Rule Tanguy, there is a cost for that, and they don't do it. It's not open all day. They do it certain times that they take people down there. If you are mobily restricted at all, there is a bazillion steps to get up and down from there, and no elevator. But it is fantastic to go see. Another fantastic place is, of course, the Musée de l'Armée, which is Les Invalides. That museum is just incredible. I just went again the other day. I go there probably every other month, but I went specifically to go through the World War II section. They have on the south side, they have World War I, World War II, and it's chronological. And you go through World War I first, of course, and then you go through the World War II part. And again, there's this dress that's in there that I would just die for, that I have seen for 8-9 years, that I remember the first time I saw it. And they used to sell a scarf of the same pattern, a silk scarf, and I kicked myself that I never bought it. But it is really fantastic. And there's even a little bit about my favorite lady, Rose Ballon, which I'll tell you more about soon if you don't know who she is. And there's also another museum there that actually I think a lot of people miss, is the Museum of the Order of the Liberation. The Order of the Liberation is the award given, and it is really fantastic. Sadly, 98% of those awards were all given to men. There's only a handful of women that are there, and I was looking for every one of them. And even my girl Rose Valland was not given that, which she should have. But it is really fantastic, and I forget when I went there the other day that these places are really difficult for me, because I kind of absorb all whatever that kind of what I'm looking at. And so when I see, the Order of the Liberation, the downstairs part of it, it's 2 floors, 2 hallways, and the downstairs it's so great. They have, Jean Moulin and all of these amazing figures that, led the resistance, and the vast majority of them lost their lives. And then upstairs, it's about the camps, the deportation and the camps. And that just always makes me just sad and sick that this is what we do to people, and we are doing it again. Amazing that we could even be at a point in time that this is something that's happening, but it's just it's really heavy, but I think it's also really, really, really important to see and witness. If you really want to put yourself through the ringer, you could go to the Shoah and also the Deportation Museum that's at the end of the Ile de la Cité, just right past Notre Dame, which might actually be closing. They're closing the garden as of yesterday. I need to check to see if the museum is still open, but that's another free museum, and it's beautiful. It is so beautifully done, and it is so amazing, and I could just about start crying talking about it. But it's heavy. It's really, really, really heavy. But all of these things I think are so great, and they're so important to see. I mentioned the Choltitz. He ended up writing a book. He is not one to be taken as this hero, as he liked to paint himself in his book that he wrote, is Paris Burning. But he, thank goodness he didn't destroy Paris, but he did a lot of really horrible things before that. So, but there is a movie in 1966 called Is Paris Burning? And it is fantastic. I looked everywhere. I cannot find it any place online, even where you could purchase it right now. They did a fantastic exhibit last year at the Liberation Museum about the movie, and it was really great. And it was really controversial at the time because people thought, oh, they're trying to push this, this certain agenda and political stance by doing this, when they were just actually making a movie about the historical content of that. But it included some actual footage of the streets of Paris. And you could find some things on YouTube. I found quite a few different compilations of videos put together from that actual footage filmed in Paris. But one other fantastic thing to watch, if you haven't seen it, and it's called A French Village. It's a French TV show from years ago, and it is on MHZ Choice, which is kind of like an app that you could get through Apple TV or Amazon. Years ago, it was on Netflix, and so I'm sure it will make its way back there at some point, or to Amazon Prime. But it is fantastic, and it is done takes place in a Rhone Alps town, a fictional town, and it starts basically at the Nazis just took this town nearby, and it goes all the way through. All the seasons go all the way through the war, and then at the end of the war, and it just shows you what these people had to live through and the choices they had to make. And if you're coming to Paris and you want to do a liberation tour and walk through the city, and I'll show you many of these markings and places, make sure you reach out and book a tour. I've got quite a few of them coming up. So thank you so much for joining me on this really important day in history, 86 years ago. And I can't wait to be back with you next week for another story that happened during World War II at one of my favorite places. So until then, a bientôt.